This is a recent project. It was an exhibition that was funded in part by Mercy University, and it was a faculty development project looking at Latin American work and finding some information that might influence my own painting. This is one of the more recent paintings on panel, my husband fishing, and this just serves as a template to kind of get us going. I'll kind of be dissecting the reasons why things look a certain way, the composition, the influences, etc. We started off the project with a trip to San Antonio. Never been to San Antonio. We stayed right near the Alamo. It was a great walk around town. And spent a lot of time up and down the river walk. On the left there is one of the boats that go back and forth, little tour boats. But they have this great design that reminds me of some of the influences of Mexican culture, particularly. And so that kind of stayed with me. You'll see that pop up a little bit later. We went to a couple of different museums, and one of the museums, there were two really that we favored, and they had such extraordinary richness of art and culture, provided an insight into the regional culture and history that I really hadn't known before. Some of what we saw included these little pieces, which are obviously religious in tone. And these are presentations that have a certain kind of decoration on them that is separate from the pictorial illusion, right? So you've got the gold that sits on the surface that sort of highlights how precious and beautiful and really special that these saints are, right? And then the image on the right, I don't know if you can see around the perimeter, there are these different sorts of images. One is a ship, a couple others that refer to the landscape, and they seem to have a special role in a kind of particular prayerfulness. In some of my reading, found that the ship, in the cases of some Latin American imagery, refers to the traveler. That doesn't seem so surprising. I know in ancient Egyptian culture, the ship was also something that was taking you from one point of living, but then to death. It was a vehicle to get to the afterworld. So in Egyptian, obviously, is very different than looking at some of these images, but the idea of moving from one state to another, right? The idea of not just traveling, but sort of in a metaphorical way or in a bigger way, transforming or moving from one place to another, one state to another, is something that stayed with me. Also, the gold did too. Over and over, I saw kind of a spectacular application of metallic, the image on the left, so I'm kind of taking the image I left with in the previous slide and making a point about this one particularly. These are called ex votos, and this was a sort of Spanish folk painting that included a saint. It included sometimes a miracle or some sort of prayer, something that was pointed to an activity that took place, or that was hopeful in it taking place. And then oftentimes there was an inscription, maybe on the back or the front of these little paintings, that talked about what actually took place, why the particular saint was there, and what the prayer specifically was. So, in this case, there's a little bus in the background that looks like maybe there was a bus accident. This is painted on tin. It's got a silver underpainting to it, like just covering the tin itself, and then these little kind of folk paintings of people praying. This is from my mother's collection. The image on the right, really different. It's from Goya, and he is a very well-known Spanish painter who is giving us a more academic ex voto. He had suffered some terrible disease in his life, one that left him deaf, and then he had another bout of presumably the same sickness, and Dr. Arrieta came and aided the painter and healed him back to rejuvenation. So this was a painting that he did sort of as a thank you note, but it fits within this folk tradition of ex voto paintings, where there's an activity. There's, instead of a supernatural saint, there's an earthly saint, the idea of the form of a doctor, providing a kind of miracle in resuming one's health. So the activity is portrayed, and then what's cut off in the painting, but there's a little inscription on the bottom that sort of reveres Dr. Arrieta for what he's done. So this kind of painting, the idea of a kind of religiosity, but a sort of merging with the experience of the world, and a kind of like prayerfulness. This impacted me, and it really overlaps with how I've thought about painting in the past. In my examinations of different things, my daughter and I took a little trip down to the city, and one very hot summer day saw the work of Enrico Martinez Solea at the Hispanic Society in Upper Manhattan. So his work struck me in a number of different ways. I had never encountered his work, and so since then I've done a lot of investigation. He's really quite fascinating. But in this particular circumstance, he was very interested. Well, he sort of had used as a catapult this little painting by Velázquez that's in the permanent collection of the Hispanic Society, a portrait of a girl. And apparently when he was a young boy in Cuba, he had a notebook, and on the face of the notebook was this painting. And so he felt a predilection for this painting, for Velázquez, and has a very interesting biography, studied science, was immersed in the sciences professionally, and then became, and then kind of, he'd always apparently been painting, but then sort of really focused on it more seriously. The installation, these are two shots from another point of view in the Hispanic Society, where you can see his work included very large canvases, and on the left you see that it's a really like illusionistic painting of waves, and then inside the waves are these very childlike scrawlings of sorts of drawings and kind of a private coded vocabulary, and apparently these are from his notebooks. So he's an immigrant. He's somebody who's spent his professional life for the most part in the States, as I understand it. So there's this movement, again, kind of like from one state to another, the sea evoking the movement of travel from one location, his home in Cuba, to another. There's projections. I don't know if you could see those. There's small little scrawlings that were projected around kind of the ceiling space, the lower ceiling space of the Hispanic Society. And these also seem like a coded kind of language that comes from his notebooks. And then, as in the previous slide, around the picture by Velázquez are these small little paper boats strung almost like screens, like you would string beads. But these are little paper boats that are made by school children. So there's this really interesting, very ethereal combination of images that provide us some very poetic reading of things that include kind of memory, heritage, our relationship to our childhood. Also at the Hispanic Society are these great murals by the Spanish artist Soraya. And these have always struck me. They're very, he's considered like the Spanish Sargent. So there's this impressionistic quality to them that's very rich and vibrant. And he's painting Spanish culture. There's a number of different sorts of images that speak to either really specific customs, ways of dress, but then also sort of more generalized kind of, locations and whatnot, or general sort of fishing comes up a lot. This is a study, and it's in gouache. And when I came across the gouache studies for the final composition, I really felt like I was looking at more of my language. He's very proficient, way more proficient than I, but somebody that has a loose brushwork, paints with about the figure. This is on brown paper. I just gravitate toward working on, surfaces that seem more fugitive. And while I don't do this, this is very interesting to me that these figures in the foreground, the sort of two dark ones, are actually glued, like they're cut out, collaged elements. Maybe perhaps there was something he wanted to mask, or he wanted to include differently. He took, cutouts that were painted on other paper and then embedded them in the composition here. Another artist I found really compelling is Carmen Lomas Garza, and her pictures have a very sort of quaint, sort of charming style, pretty non-academic, but what they do is celebrate the family goings on, and some are very specifically cultural. In this sort of making tamales that's illustrated here on the right, and this is the cover of her little book called Family Pictures, which is a children's book. It's a very, very charming book about her memories as a child. She's a Cuban American artist living in Texas. And the one on the left, a little more general. And this reminded me, so many images reminded me of my childhood. My heritage is very different. But activities, not so much. My father and I would sit on the roof looking for shooting stars. The image on the left, these siblings on the roof in the picture here. There's other pictures that are oriented to the kitchen where, the mom is cooking. So many memories I have of, sitting and either helping after dinner or chatting, and lots of conversations in the kitchen. This is another one by the same artist that has, this just quiet interior. So if I haven't made mention of this, the religious motifs are very familiar to me. Our Lady of Guadalupe is not something necessarily that I grew up seeing. It was, but Mary is an important feature in my having grown up in a Catholic household, lots of Mary. So pictures that have a religiosity and iconography that's particularly Catholic is something that's an overlap as well. This is a picture real different than the previous that I've been showing, but something that really struck me and stayed with me. I really couldn't shake this picture, and I found it to be so compelling. I didn't look up the context of the picture until I was till after our visit to San Antonio. But this was in the Museum of San Antonio, and it's Saint Isidora, who's the patron saint of farmers, and it's by a Bolivian artist. And what he presents the saint to be is a 16th century sort of landowner, and all of the little depictions around them, which I found just this beautiful depiction of life around a farmer, happens to do with his miracles, different sorts of things that would have taken. Some of it is specifically Bolivian activities and landscapes, but some of it refers to the heritage of Saint Isidora's miracles specifically. Um, the scale relationship I found really interesting. This hieratic scale of having the saint placed so squarely in the middle, but then also so much bigger than everything else. And then the illustrations, you know, we read them as farther back, but we also read them as just tiny, that give us packed in all of this different storytelling, really about the life of this saint. Something that I have always been drawn to is this idea of charm, little charms that act as totems. And these milagros, these are simply from internet searches. But I saw some as we were, in San Antonio, other sorts of investigations. This idea of having, and they're embedded in these ex votos as abstractions. They're like partial limbs or breasts or hands, eyes, and they have references to certain things. A hand is a symbol of benevolence, but it's also connected to sometimes the hand of God. An eye can be a similar sort of thing. It can reference an all-seeing God, but it can also specifically talk about vision, talk about something that you're seeing or that you want help with seeing, and maybe that's very physical in nature, that your vision is impaired. Hearts show up a lot as milagros. Hands again show up here. These little tin charms that are cutouts that are pinned to other sorts of things. Here's a framed composition of milagros, but you can also see them pinned to sculptural forms of hearts or painted in these different ex votos I've been referencing. The decorative nature of these colorful flags, they remind me very much of the motifs I saw on the riverboats in San Antonio, and these stayed with me. So this is some of my painting. You'll see on the borders, I incorporated shapes that reminded me of some of the motifs along those riverboats as decoration. And these are really large paintings. They're on unstretched canvas. The canvas was primed, and I did an underpainting in oil and then painted on top of it in acrylic. And these are montages that have sort of my own personal narrative, my own background, but I tried to include sort of an influence of what I had been looking at in some of the artists and artwork that I've been mentioning. So, we have sort of the iconography of a religious nature. I tried not to embed things so that the pictorial space was unified. I wanted it to be actually kind of using sort of kind of a separateness. So you were reading these things more as icons rather than something that was really sitting in the landscape, right? So this is a representation of the Sacred Heart, but in visual terms, we've got another Sacred Heart coming up that's just the heart itself. My daughter with New York in the background, my parents with a more bucolic, New England environment, and then them in the foreground as kind of the linchpin. This is like probably the 1980, early 80s. They're representing, kind of thinking about time. Time shows up a lot in these. Another image here, the Sacred Heart kind of floating in the sky space. Boats show up in these. And my husband and my daughter shows up in a lot of motifs, and myself as a much, much younger individual. And then some of these motifs around the exterior coming from a Mexican print. But then it doesn't translate in the slide, but it's treated as it's a silver paint. Again, my daughter on her cell phone with this great image of it's really not a saint, it's more of a queen that comes from perhaps from a chess game. It's something random that showed up in my own shelves. So here she is on the backside, kind of hovering over the shoulder of my daughter. A ship, that ship really meaning kind of moving from one state to another. The blue jay, a backyard bird, something that's kind of common, and it sort of it flitters around in a gang. Oftentimes you see about three, and they squawk a lot or loud, but they're so beautiful, kind of giving us, I think blue jays sort of meld the very ethereal sort of symbolism that birds represent, and this sort of like down home, thing that you see in your backyard, something that's pretty common. The heart, instead of it like a milagro that I've shown earlier, this is more of an anatomical drawing of a heart beating over my daughter. Another representation of the heart, more like a tin heart, seen over my daughter and my husband. And then the black crow, in some cultures it represents the idea of some transgression or something that's got a more negative sort of blight to it. But what I found in some reading throughout this project was that the black crow represents transformation, and that makes more sense to me. So here it is, representations of myself, the idea of time, youthfulness, and sort of what I hope for my daughter as she moves through her time. So these are smaller paintings. They're much, much smaller by comparison. They're just 8 by 8 or 10 by 10. And they've got to do with snapshots of, again, family life, goings on, rather than make the elaborate patterns that would be way too small for me to do in this small area. I just sort of reduced it to color. The heart showing here, my daughter and her friends with a crow. So these things that are hovering are more, they're totems. They're things that represent a kind of symbolic value, and they come from my own investigations, not necessarily ascribing to one convention. I sort of mix and match my husband on his motorcycle, and then the Hazma hand representing a kind of benevolent prayerfulness, really, or protection, as he's off on his rides. The boat, these are on paper. They're a little bit bigger than the panels I just showed, and they also, investigate ideas that are more symbolic. I feel like there's more to do with some of them. Some of these recall memories. They have more illusionistic forms, like these, the fish or the lobster. Some of them way more symbolic. The red-winged blackbird is a bird I've always felt is sort of magical. It flits around. It's got a beautiful little song. And then the blue jay back, which I always kind of gravitate to the blue jay. Idea of time showing up literally with the clock. This is one last composition from this project. It's another little panel painting, little wooden panel painting. And this time, this is my husband in San Antonio, so kind of full circle to the beginning of the grouping of topics. And there's a guitar player right over his shoulder, a little mariachi band that was making its way around. And then the little ex voto milagro representation of benevolence with the heart in the hand. I'm curious, any questions that you're welcome to email me or follow me on Instagram at a loud rattle, which I'll post right here in the last slide. Thanks for listening.